Not long ago, it was cold and dark. So what happened? Someone made a decision. Someone looked at a microbe and thought he could use a longer flagella and a pair of pinchers too. Yeah!
There was a game released in the late 2000s that promised to be one of the most revolutionary and ambitious games of all time. A game that would simulate an entire galaxy populated with user-created creatures. A game that allowed you to create nearly anything your imagination could think up. A game that would simulate the long story of evolution playing out on an alien planet that you would come to call your own. My name's Firewolf, and this is the unfortunate fate of Spore, a game that came so close to being the greatest video game of all time. Spore was an evolution life simulation game created by game studio Maxis and published by Electronic Arts, also known as EA, in 2008. The game was the passion project of well-renowned game designer Will Wright, creator of the famous SimCity and the Sims franchise. For Wright, Spore was the longtime dream project he had been thinking about for quite some time. It would rival anything he had ever worked on before, and it would be one of the most ambitious games ever conceived of up to that point.
So in some sense, we want Spore to be this very rich toy box. When you open it up, there are all these different places you can go, things you can make. The game occurs at all these different scales, from the very tiny cellular all the way up to the very large intergalactic level. At Cell, it's almost like a kind of very fluid game of Pac-Man. You're moving around, there's squishy, weird creatures that you're interacting with. When we get to Creature, it's almost more of a first-person shooter. And that's also where the creativity of the creature editor becomes kind of really upfront in terms of the wide variety of creatures that you can create really drive your playstyle.
Spore was originally titled Sim Everything, and what Will Wright had in mind for this massive project was exactly as the working title suggested. In Sim Everything, the player would guide a simple species of single-celled organisms through their evolution to eventually become a spacefaring civilization. Along the way, the player would be able to create and design not only their creature's appearance, but their technology, their buildings, their music, and even their clothing style. The game would rely heavily on cutting-edge technology, such as procedural generation, in order to create random and unique planets and solar systems on the fly with code. A technology that would go on to be used in other games such as Minecraft to create its infinite yet never repeating landscapes. Rather than having to design everything by hand, the game would use mathematical algorithms to generate new assets in real time. This innovative technology would be essential as Sim Everything would feature an entirely simulated galaxy with hundreds of thousands of planets to explore. In addition to this, other creatures seen within the galaxy of Sim Everything would be player created. Every living thing in the game would be a creature designed by another player and then downloaded into their game through the internet. In order to pull off such a feat, Maxis, the studio behind the project, needed to go through an intensive research and development phase, as nothing on such a scale had ever been attempted before.
Because we wanted the game to be very different, very procedural, and very based upon the user's creativity, we faced a number of significant technical issues about how can we do procedural animation, procedural texturing, things like that.
How do you deal with, a creature that needs to animate that we don't know what it's going to be before it gets spit into the game?
Keep in mind that this was still nearly a decade before No Man's Sky even existed. Arguably the most celebrated aspect of Spore is its freedom of creativity. The team at Maxis developed a system that allowed the player to create 3D creatures, buildings, and vehicles easily and quickly with intuitive and simple to grasp controls. The creature designer was the most fleshed out of these tools and one of the most used by the player in order to design their creature as it evolved throughout the game. The player would progress through 6 distinct stages of the game, these being the cell, aquatic, creature, tribal, civilization, and space stage. The aquatic stage, however, would be eventually cut at some point during development. Each of these stages had unique gameplay and required the player to design and evolve their creature as it progressed through the stage. To say that Spore was an ambitious game would be a bit of an understatement. System upon system was designed from the ground up in order to bring Will Wright's vision of an evolution space opera to life. Everything down to the way the creatures moved and behaved would be procedurally generated, ensuring that no two species in Spore were ever alike. Creatures would have procedurally generated skeletal systems and animations so that they moved in a realistic way no matter what the player came up with, even if they gave them 12 limbs.
We wanted Spore to be this very wide perspective. The simplest form of life has the potential to go out and have immense, interesting interactions in this basically lifeless galaxy. That's really the story of Spore. What does a lifeless galaxy look like? Then you drop life in. What does that life do within the galaxy? And in doing so, you actually end up hitting all these different scientific subjects. And you get an interesting perspective on things like physics and chemistry, biology, sociology. Starting at the very beginning of the game, we're using kind of a panspermia theory of life coming to this planet, starting single cell, then going up through evolution. One of the interesting things that happens is that you have the successive kind of interplay between cooperation and competition. You'll have little cells competing. At some point, some of them decide to group together and cooperate, and they become specialized, and you get multicellular organisms. Then you have individual creatures competing. At some point, some of them start grouping together, forming very simple little societies, out-competing the individuals. And as a society, they also tend to specialize. I see evolution as kind of this interplay between competition, driving cooperation, driving specialization, which then brings the competition to the next level.
With such a massive project and a huge team of designers working on the game, it was inevitable that some within the studio would begin to have second thoughts about the direction they were taking the project. It wasn't long until two distinct groups were formed inside the development team. According to Wright, these two sides of the fence were nicknamed the cute side and the science side. These names referred mostly to the argument over the visual aesthetic the game would take. Many, including Will Wright himself, wanted Spore to be a scientifically accurate simulation game with a realistic graphical approach. Others, including members of EA, the publishing company on the project, felt that the game needed to appeal to a wider audience and should be more child-friendly with a cute and whimsical style. Tensions grew in the studio between these two differing approaches, but ultimately it was the cute side that won out. EA wanted the game to sell well and thought that the scientific game would be too niche of a product, so they asked the team to cut many of the features and systems they had already developed in order to make a game more simple and approachable to a casual audience. Cut features included the procedural skeletal and animation system, the aquatic stage of the game, customizable tribe stage buildings, and many more planned features. In addition to these cuts, the team also made massive changes to the game's overall aesthetic, removing blood, making characters more cute and cartoonish, and adding in a lot of goofy jokes and references to the game to soften the tone and make the game more childlike. The biggest problem with all these changes to the game and the graphical style was that the game had already been shown extensively to the public prior to these changes. In fact, the game had a massive amount of hype surrounding it, and people's expectations were already set on a realistic evolution simulator with complex systems and real-world science. So to say that people were a bit confused and angered by the sudden shift in style would be a bit of an understatement. Many people took to the internet to express their disappointment with how the game had developed and how far it had strayed from what was initially shown before launch. Most of what people knew from the game came from the showcase in 2005. The game was shown for the first time before any changes had been made to the game's overall aesthetics. It showed the journey from a single-celled organism to a galactic civilization and was presented by Will Wright himself. It was so well received that by the end of the showcase, it actually received a standing ovation from the audience, and according to Will Wright himself, one person in the front of the audience actually got on his knees and bowed to him. So, needless to say, people were extremely hyped for the release of Spore. It was shaping up to be one of the biggest releases in gaming history.
By far and away, the most interesting stories I've heard from computer gamers are always the stories that they tell me about what they did in the game. What we're doing with like The Sims and Spore is more about letting the players fully own the characters because they created them.
You start as a little cellular organism.
You know, a blob with eyeballs stuck on it, whose only need in the universe is to eat, and eating makes him grow.
The challenge is to evolve, and you create your species at every stage of its evolution.
Once you crawl out of that environment onto land is where Creature Game picks up.
Now you're in an entirely 3D space.
You have this amazing editor basically allowing you to make anything you want. Depending on what you make, you can be faster or slower, you can be carnivorous, omnivorous, a very social creature or a very aggressive creature.
When reviewers actually got their hands on the game, however, opinions were pretty mixed. Many people felt that the new direction the game had made was too childish, and others thought that the game was a shell of its former self, being dumbed down in order to appeal to a wider audience. Many of the unique and innovative features the game promised were seemingly gone, and in their place was generic and overly simplistic gameplay. People generally felt misled, but it wouldn't be the only problem facing the game at launch. Spore was also subject to controversy due to its handling of copyright enforcement. Now known as DRM, Digital Rights Management, Spore limited the amount of times that the game could be installed to just 5 installations. If the customer exceeded these limits, the game would no longer allow you to install it, despite purchasing the product legitimately. This was done in order to prevent people from sharing their product keys online or giving their game disc to their friends to install for free. The approach, however, was seen as extremely aggressive and controversial. People retaliated against the practice, and ironically, Spore would become one of the most pirated video games in history. Spore would be the start of EA's now infamous DRM schemes across nearly all their subsequent products. The practice would add further fuel onto the already massive dumpster fire that was Spore's release. The backlash over the game was so great that Will Wright actually retired from the video game industry shortly after its release, an industry that he had been part of for nearly 25 years. Despite all the controversy surrounding Spore and the mixed reviews of the game, there were still many people who managed to fall in love with the game, myself included. The game today is seen as a kind of cult classic by some, and has a niche community of dedicated fans to this day. Thousands of Spore creations are still being made every single day and uploaded to the Sporepedia, which is an online archive of Spore-made assets. Many within the community admit that Spore did not live up to its potential or many of its promises. It remains one of the biggest letdowns in gaming history. However, in recent years, many people who grew up with Spore have banded together on internet forums and social media to create new games that are inspired by Spore and attempt to achieve what it could not. One of these passion projects is Elysium Eclipse, currently being developed by a single individual and backed by Patreon subscriptions. Another of these projects is the game Thrive, which is one of the longest running Spore-inspired games and is currently available on Steam through early access. And of course, it's impossible not to see the inspiration Spore had on the game No Man's Sky, a game that also faced similar backlash on release for failing to live up to expectations, but has managed to fully restore itself and its reputation thanks to countless free updates that are still being rolled out to this day. Perhaps if Spore had been released in a time of DLC, then the game would have been able to save itself in a similar way to No Man's Sky. The game, however, did receive 2 expansion packs, one of which was a very small and simple add-on that just added a few more parts to the already fleshed out creature creator. The other was a more sizable expansion that allowed the player to exit their spaceship in the space stage and take on user-created missions on the surface of other planets. These expansions, however, did little to boost the reviews of the game or bring in any new fans. While Spore failed to live up to expectations, it still managed to leave a lasting impression in the gaming community. Many people remember the game fondly, despite its many flaws and controversies. To answer the question of what happened to Spore, Maxis, I think, simply bit off more than it could chew. Couple that with the misdirection and aggressive anti-piracy schemes from EA, as well as the division within the design team, and you get a game that failed to deliver on its promises. However, despite this, Spore did have an impact, and many of the innovations and systems invented during the creation of Spore went on to be utilized in other games. Games like Minecraft, Terraria, and No Man's Sky all use procedural generation that was popularized by Spore. Spore was possibly one of the most ambitious games ever produced, and while it wasn't what people expected or hoped for, it nevertheless was an important footnote in the history of video games and inspired a new generation of game designers to take up the challenge of creating a truly successful sim everything. But what did Spore mean to me? There was a time when I considered Spore to be my all-time favorite game. I first learned about the game on early YouTube back in 2007 when I discovered this video.
Okay, we start here, and we're in the land of the very small. I'm actually controlling this little guy around here. This is basically cellular scale. We have like some fluid dynamics. This basically is a very analog, fluid version of Pac-Man.
I, like so many others, were captivated by this simple, straightforward gameplay that just seemed to keep getting bigger and bigger as you watched. It all seemed so magical, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. In fact, I became a bit obsessed. I can't even tell you how many times I watched and then rewatched that entire press event. And eventually the day would arrive where I got my hands on Spore. The game was released in September of 2008, and my older brother had secretly bought me the collector's edition of Spore for my birthday. I was so excited I could barely contain myself, but somehow I'd have to find a way, because it turned out that I couldn't play the game just yet. Our family computer at the time was still running Windows XP, and the game required you to have Windows Vista to install it. So there the game sat on my shelf, beckoning me for about a few months. Day after day, I'd look upon it like the apes in 2001 would stare upon the obelisk. But I did have a plan. My best friend at the time had a Windows Vista computer, and so I knew what would have to be done. I'd go over to his house and bring the game with me, and I'd play it at his place, and that's exactly what I did. Finally, the day arrived when my parents could drive me to his house, and I made sure I had permission to spend the night. And the rest was history. We stayed up all night playing Spore, taking turns on the game every few hours. It was simply everything I had hoped for. It didn't really bother me so much at the time that the graphics had changed from what I had seen in 2005, and I hardly even noticed that the ocean stage was missing. To me, the game was just simply a masterpiece. I left the game at his place for a while since it did no good being at my place, and he'd play the game when I was gone. We had already been super close friends before Spore, but I think Spore just made us that much closer. It's all we talked about and all we played for quite a while. Eventually, my friend would move on to other games, but I just kept playing Spore. My family finally would get a PC with Vista installed on it, and so I could play it at my place now. I got the Galactic Adventures expansion when it came out, and also the creepy and cute parts pack, and that just furthered my love for the game. I made tons of missions with the new adventure creator that was added in the expansion, and a lot of people actually played them and left comments. I think it's actually one of the things that fueled my interest in game design. The only other thing I knew like it at the time was the map editor in Warcraft 3, which I also sunk a lot of hours into. I was so obsessed with the game that I used to write the word Spore randomly on things whenever my family would take us out somewhere. I remember writing it in the sand at the beach and using a Sharpie to write it on the bathroom walls. It's almost like Spore had become some sort of religion or something for me, and I was simply spreading the good word of Spore to the unenlightened. However, as I got older and spent more time online, I started to see the opinions of others on the game, and I eventually started to resent the game. It began to anger me that the game hadn't delivered all that it promised, and that it had such a drastic shift in style during development. As I went into middle school and high school, I left Spore behind. And whenever I'd talk about the game to others, I'd talk about it in a pretty negative way. Nowadays, I find myself somewhere in the middle. I don't think that Spore is a bad game, and I also don't really think it's a great game either. But I can't deny what Spore once meant to me and how nostalgic it's become for me. I regularly return to the game just to experience some of that nostalgia and to try and remember a time when life wasn't so complicated and when I could just enjoy a game for what it was instead of analyzing it and picking apart on a critical level. Spore is not a perfect game, but no game really is. It was a game that overpromised and underdelivered. It's a game that could have been so much more than it inevitably was, but Spore is also a game that lives on in the hearts of many. It's a game that has inspired the industry and pushed technology forward. It dared developers to think bigger and grander than ever before. It created a community of gamers who still share in their love for Spore to this day. Spore may have not been everything it aspired to be, but what Spore did do is inspire a new generation of designers to take up its grand ambitions, and it still remains a game people talk about to this day, and I think that's pretty cool. And that pretty much sums up the story of Spore. Thanks so much for watching to the end of this video. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss my next video. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.